Everyone, this is Dr. Pollock. Today I'm going to be talking about incivility, specifically with reference to this Mutz and Reeves article that you guys hopefully read by now. I'll try to keep this video somewhat brief just in light of us leading into finals week, and I'm sure everyone's busy, so I'll try not to have this one be a super long lecture. So let's get into it. We're going to be talking about primarily this article here today, um, to where the overall point is pretty well expressed in the title. The new video malaise, specifically the effects of televised incivility on political trust. Okay, so we'll talk about that a lot. I'm also going to reference here, and if anyone read this article and you were interested in the topic and you want to read more about it, this is a book I own. Unfortunately, I don't have it on my person right now since I haven't been able to access my office. Uh, but this is a good book just in terms of really taking this topic of incivility and expanding it a lot. Okay, it's very similar to the article, just going into a lot more depth, using some additional experimentation, looking at additional outcomes. I'm going to reference some of what this book talks about as we go along, just because it's so similar. And you see the author here, Diana Mutz, who has left my screen for some reason. Uh, Diana Mutz is the author of the book. She's one of the authors on this paper. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings in this book as they become relevant in the discussion. So just to summarize, sticking with the paper for now, the briefest summary of this paper would be this. We have an independent variable, we have a dependent variable. In this case, the relationship that's being theorized and tested is pretty simple. I'll talk more about each of these different concepts, of course, but the fundamental relationship is pretty straightforward. Incivility, that could probably be a little bit better. Incivility is leading to distrust in government. Okay. Specifically, it's going to be, and I'll talk about this more in a second. Specifically, we're going to be talking about visual depictions of incivility. Incivility, maybe we can go in more detail here. Incivility, specifically in terms of politicians or those who are political elites that people are seeing on the news. Incivility leading to distrust in government. And I wanted to just talk about, broadly speaking, these two different concepts here, incivility and distrust, before getting into the specifics of the paper. So here our primary outcome measure, distrust in government, is something that we haven't really talked about that much in the semester so far, right? So when we're talking about trust in government, this is just the idea that people believe that the elected officials who have power in government are doing the things that they should be doing, are doing what's right. Okay, so that's the overall meaning here of trust in government. In this case, it's phrased in the negative, distrust, but trust in government, just the extent to which people believe elected officials are doing the right thing in government. And this is something that Mutz and Reeves break down into more specific, I should say, aspects of trust. So you can get into, they talk about, for instance, trust in politicians, trust in Congress specifically, and then a broader level of trust in government. So there are different ways we can conceive of this, but generally speaking, it's the extent to which people are viewing the actors in government as doing the right thing. And so this is something that I wanted to just talk a little bit about because, again, I don't believe that this has come up as a major measure, either an outcome or a factor, an independent variable in any of the papers we've talked about so far. And so why do we care about trust? Okay, why should we care about whether or not people trust their government? In general, this is something that public opinion scholars have studied a lot, the extent to which people trust their government and then the effects of either trust or distrust in government. Generally speaking, this is something that has declined a lot over the last half century, right? So we can specifically point to the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal as being pretty dramatic catalyst towards people moving from a state of trust to distrust, right? So we had, over the latter part of the 20th century, a pretty steep decline in people's trust in the federal government, which has persisted today. And this is something that transcends presidents and administrations and decades at this point. We're at a pretty low point of trust in government in the country. And so that's something that, from a normative perspective, many scholars have pointed to as something that perhaps we might be interested in improving, the extent to which people view the government is doing the right thing. Okay. And so just in terms of what this variable is linked to, why we should care about it. So there's been a lot of empirical research on trust in government. So trust, when people trust their government in a democratic context, it does a couple of different things that most would consider desirable, right? So first of all, it's increasing participation. When people trust that those in government are doing the right thing, turnout and other measures of political participation tend to be higher. Okay? So that's one thing. Uh, in a more systematic sense, trusting the government lends legitimacy to it. So people are more likely to view the government as legitimate, and this is leading to stability of democratic regimes. This is maybe not in the American context that important. We're not really a system that is associated with high levels of instability, right? So the United States has a pretty extensive, lengthy history of democracy at this point, to where maybe for other countries that don't have that long, multiple centuries worth of experience in a democratic system, trust in government might be a lot more important, right? To where if you're in a system that's a transitioning democracy or a young democracy, perhaps having people on board and trusting their democratic representatives is even more important than it would be for us. One thing that you do see also, this is when we get into a situation of distrusting government, one thing you see is that people, the importance that they place on complying with the government decreases as well. So people tend to express more acceptance of illegal behavior when they distrust the government. All right, so this is something to where trust is, generally speaking, something that political scholars would say is a good thing. It's not something that we want to go. We don't want to be so trusted in government, obviously, that we're complacent or we're trusting government too much, right? If there's a legitimate reason not to trust the government, we're not. Nobody's saying that should be just glossed over. But in an ideal scenario, we would want government to earn everyone's trust, right? In an ideal scenario, the government would earn everyone's trust. And so when we see decreasing trust, specifically maybe in something like incivility, to where maybe it's preventable decreases in distrust, it's something that many people would be concerned with. And so that's why this is the outcome measure of interest, that it's something that has a degree of normative importance to many political scientists. Okay, and so that's trust in government. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. That was just my short introduction to scholarly approaches to trust in government. In terms of incivility, I probably don't need to explain this in that much detail. We know what incivility entails, and we can all think of numerous examples of incivility in contemporary politics or really any era of politics. So incivility just involves the violation of norms of interpersonal conduct, because it would be things like shouting at someone, ad hominem attacks, expressions of emotion that go beyond what's usually expected in society. So we take a broad look at this term, a broad conception of it, I should say, right? Incivility just constitutes a violation of the norms of conduct toward another person. And again, this is something that we know incivility when we see it, and so it's probably not something that we need to get into a really lengthy definition of. The key here for this paper, I should say, is this. There's the idea that goes around, and this isn't something that I'm trying to either dismiss or confirm, but there's an idea that goes around in the year 2020 and any year really going back as far as I've covered politics, the idea that incivility is becoming more prevalent. Okay, so we're in 2020, and many people would say, well, we're in an era where incivility is a lot higher than it was if we go back 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years, or whatever. And that's something to where that's not really the point of the paper here, that incivility is either increasing, decreasing, or staying the same. That's something to where, at least in my own view, the overall trajectory of incivility is not entirely clear. I don't know that there's been a ton of systematic evidence collected to say one way or another that we're more or less uncivil in this era or some other era. Mutz, I think for her part, she talks about how, in this article briefly, Mutz and Reeves, they talk about it, and then in the book I mentioned, you can point back to various historical episodes or eras in history, and there's really not ever been an era of politics in the United States that we would say is civil. Okay, so we could go back to periods in time in which disagreements between politicians were settled by duels. We can point to historical episodes in which people were beaten with canes on the floor of the United States Congress. And so there's some argument to be made that we've always had incivility in politics. It's an interesting question whether or not there's more or less in modern politics. This is not a question, though, that this paper is answering. What this paper is instead doing is saying the way that Americans encounter incivility has changed. Okay, if we go back 100 years, okay, there was really no means for people to directly witness politicians behaving in an uncivil manner. So maybe they were behaving in an uncivil manner, but it's not something that people had an opportunity to directly witness. When we go into the television era, and now this is all equally applicable in the internet era, the point being, we're in an era now in which people can, by and large, witness these uncivil displays in a using, in other words, video. Okay, we have televised video of politicians behaving in an uncivil manner toward one another. We have internet video, a variety of widely available media in which people can directly witness politicians behaving in an uncivil manner. That's the key point of this paper, that's what's changed in recent decades. Okay, the way that people are encountering or witnessing their politicians and the ability to directly view through video the uncivil behavior. Okay, so this linkage is new. Okay, what I have on the border, this linkage is new not because incivility is this brand new phenomenon that's never happened before. It's a new linkage just because the way that people have been able to witness their politicians behaving has changed and evolved in the television era and into the internet era. Okay, so this is my introduction here. Let me get into some specifics here of exactly why this linkage occurs, or at least the argument that the authors here are putting forward as to why incivility is causing distrust in government. Okay, so this is a theory that I think there is based on a couple of key premises here that I'll point out and just describe just briefly. The first is getting to the way that people perceive audiovisual material on TV or on their computer or whatever. Sensory realism. Okay, this is the idea that in terms of senses, the way that people are perceiving, okay, when they see incivility on TV or they see incivility on their computer screen, this is the idea that people, their minds are not able to distinguish, we're not evolutionarily equipped to distinguish these indirect depictions through a TV, through a computer, from in-person witnessing incivility, right? So in the evolutionary environment, there were no, in other words, going back hundreds of thousands of years, there were no TVs, there were no computers. And so if we were witnessing people behaving in a way that violated norms toward one another, the only way that was happening was in person. Okay, so evolutionarily speaking, our minds are not equipped to make this distinction between, okay, this is happening on TV or this is happening in person for me. Okay, so the sum of this, the term sensory realism is referring to the idea that television, and I'm probably going to speak just to television here, I'll use that term, but this is again applying broadly speaking, it's the same effect here as if you're watching on the internet or a computer. Television is perceived as though the events are being directly witnessed. So again, it's a psychological phenomenon to where people are just not really equipped to separate in-person from remote, from indirect representations. And so one thing that the book goes, so I mentioned there's a book underlying this research as well. One thing that the 2015 book goes into is digging deeper into this idea of sensory realism. And so not only do people respond to television as though it were real, in a sensory manner, in a perceptual manner, the way that television in the modern television era is actually depicted, the way that the productions look and the way the shots look tends to actually exacerbate these effects. Okay, so the book here, just to go back to it briefly, it's titled "In Your Face Politics." And the reason it's titled "In Your Face" is just that you see O'Reilly here. This is a 2015 book, so in 2020 wouldn't be O'Reilly, it'd maybe be, I don't know, Sean Hannity, Rachel Maddow, Tucker Carlson. When you look at these programs, they're literally in your face, or at least the last time I've watched any of them, they tended to be in your face. Right? So oftentimes you'll see, if you imagine this, if you'll excuse my drawing, maybe your widescreen TV. Here's somebody, angry on this side. This is your news channel. There's somebody else angry on this side. And the camera, the point here for my rudimentary drawing is just that the camera is oftentimes literally in the person's face, right? The person's face is taking up most of the one side of the screen, then some other person's face is taking up the other side of the screen. And oftentimes they're depicted as being angry at one another and disagreeing with one another. So when this is the case, okay, when the camera is literally in both people's face, this tends to exacerbate the effects of sensory realism. So in other words, if you were to pan the camera back a little bit, right, if you were to back the camera up and not have it in each person's face, people are perceiving the event in a less acute manner, in a less extreme way, to where they're better able to sort of detach themselves from what's being depicted when it's not shot in this way. Okay, so we have sensory realism on one hand, and then the way that television tends to be produced in this way, in the in your face style, it tends to make these effects worse. And it'll be hopefully the last time I feel compelled to draw anything in this lecture. And so this is the first part of this theory, that people, sensory realism, people are understanding or perceiving the events that they see in politics on TV in a very direct manner. Okay. The result of this is that when you see somebody behaving in an uncivil manner, in other words, when you witness somebody violating interpersonal norms on TV, and this, just to emphasize, this is what I mean by incivility. This is what the authors, maybe is a better way to put it, mean by incivility. When you see incivility on TV, this is inducing a negative emotional response. So this is the story that the authors are telling, that it's an emotional effect, right? That we haven't, this isn't a class on political psychology per se, so we haven't talked a ton about emotion and how it affects your thinking, it affects your political thinking specifically. But the authors are saying that you're watching TV, your mind is perceiving the events on TV in largely the same way they would be perceived as if they were in person. This is inducing the same negative emotional reaction as though you just saw two people arguing right in front of you in the same room you were in. Right? So you see this, your mind is trained to think of things as though they're happening in person, and the reaction is negative. Specifically, negative emotions are emerging in your mind upon witnessing incivility on the television. And so this is, the sum of these two things is just where the distrust is coming from. Okay, so here we're, of course, talking about the specific context in which we're witnessing on television political elites or elected officials behaving in an uncivil manner toward one another. If you're watching a soap opera or some drama on television, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about specifically political media and watching our elected officials behave in this way that's evoking negative emotional response. That's the theory here. And when we get into the empirical analyses, and if you have any questions about what I'm talking about in this theoretical discussion, let me know. I don't know if it's to me, it's a fairly straightforward argument, but if I'm missing something, please let me know, and I'd be happy to discuss more with you. But the analysis here, when they get into it, is trying to demonstrate a couple of different things. It's mostly looking at the effects of distrust in government when we treat people with either an uncivil or a civil interaction between politicians. Okay, well, toward the end of the discussion, we'll talk about how the authors also test this premise, that it's fundamentally emotional response that's driving the effect. I'm probably not going to talk too much about sensory realism because it's just a phenomenon that it has strong empirical backing, but it's not really something that's tested that directly in this paper. The book talks more about it, and there's other just overall research in the field of cognitive and perceptual psychology that demonstrates that. Right? There are a variety of reasons that we know that people respond roughly in the same manner at a perceptual level as though they were witnessing the activity directly. So let's get into our analyses here. And here we're again dealing with survey experiments, or actually I think these are lab experiments. The book runs some survey experiments to get a more general subject pool. Here we're talking about lab experiments to where the overall breakdown is what we've been talking about throughout the semester. You have pre-treatment measures. I'll talk about probably one or two of these different measures. I think there's some interesting variance in treatment effects based on certain pre-treatment measures. And then it's a fairly straightforward experiment, right? So here, some people are being assigned an uncivil condition. Some people are being assigned a civil condition. Others, and this would be only experiments 2 and 3, I believe, a control where they're not witnessing anything. And then everyone is answering questions about their trust in government. So the overall layout of this experiment isn't anything too exotic. What's interesting here is that I think is, in my opinion, the way that the authors construct their treatment materials. So we have these 3 different conditions, really the 2, uncivil versus civil, and then a control condition in which you're not seeing any of these, any of the behavior, you're in other words seeing nothing, you're proceeding directly to the trust in government. But in these uncivil and civil conditions, the authors are actually filming their own material and going into a television set, an actual television set, so you have a pretty high degree of authenticity. They're using actors to play the role of 2 different politicians who are arguing with one another on different policy issues, and the content, the substance of the argument is the same. So it's the same set of arguments, it's the same points being made. It's just that in the uncivil condition, they're being respectful toward one another. They're behaving in the way we would expect people to behave toward one another if they were actually in person discussing with one another. Because you have the civil condition. In the uncivil condition, they're arguing with one another. They're calling each other. I think at some point they're calling each other names. They're really treating one another's positions in a disrespectful manner. And so the way the uncivil and civil conditions are being manipulated is fairly well done in this case, right? The experimenters have a great degree of control in just having the scenarios be basically exactly the same, except to the extent one is uncivil versus civil. So it's an interesting type of manipulation here, to where you can do the same sort of thing by sort of editing sometimes videos together to do one thing, edit one video to look civil versus uncivil. But in this case, it's an even better way to do it by actually filming the footage in an original sense here, the way the authors do. Very difficult, I would imagine, to actually do this experiment as well. You have to actually have access to a TV set. You have to have access to actors, so I presume we're paid to do this. Then you have to have cameras to actually make it look good. So it's a pretty elaborate experiment in terms of the way the stimuli are formed. Overall, though, the actual structure is pretty simple. You have 3 conditions total. This is down a lot from our Chong and Druckmann paper, where they had somewhere in the neighborhood of 16. I think, if I recall correctly, 16 conditions in their studies. So well done study in terms of the way it's constructed, but pretty straightforward. So let's just talk about the results here, what we find. So again, the trust in government is the primary dependent variable of interest here. I'm not going to go through too much about how that's being measured, but if you wanted to look more at it, this is another thing I think the authors do well in this paper is presenting their measures. They have this appendix at the end where they're showing all the different questions they asked and what you're analyzing. So this is similar to what you guys produced for your research papers in this class. This is why you have this sort of appendix, just so people, if they're curious about the details of your measure, they can go directly here and look at exactly what you're measuring and what you're asking. So in this case, you have 3 different areas of trust: trust in politicians, trust in Congress, trust in the political system, where these are all different indexes of multiple questions to where the respondents are answering, do they strongly agree, somewhat agree, neither agree or disagree, strongly disagree, or somewhat disagree. So you have a 5-point continuum from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And for instance, the general trust in political system is asking, I feel critical about our political system. I'd rather live under our form of government than any other. Maybe necessary to make major changes. So just general questions about the political system. Trust in Congress specifically, so about the institution of Congress. As far as people running Congress are concerned, we usually have a great deal of confidence, only some confidence, hardly any confidence in them at all. Trust in politicians. Politicians generally have good intentions. Politicians in the U.S. do not deserve much respect. So here you have multiple different questions tapping into each of these different dimensions of trust: politicians versus Congress versus the general political system. And so they're approaching political trust from a couple of different angles, which is, again, I think this is to the author's credit, that it's not just one question, it's not just one index, it's multiple indexes to see whether or not the effects of their treatments are robust and broad in nature. And I think in general, that's a good approach to have in your research. And so getting into some of the results here. So I guess before I get into there are a couple of figures I'll point to here. But just in general, one other thing I wanted to point out is this. Okay, so for experiments 1 and 2, okay, the DV is trust. Okay, those trust measures we talked about in a second. In experiment 2, there's actually this interesting component in which there's a retest a couple of weeks after the original experiment, which I'll talk about in a little bit as well. But for study 3, there's something interesting going on in terms of an additional dependent variable that's being analyzed here. Electrodermal activity. Okay, or a simpler way to put it, and I'll probably use this term more, so skin conductance. Okay, and so this is what we would refer to as a physiological measure. The virtue here, and I'll talk about the results as we go along, and maybe give you just more details or repeat the details as necessary, but the virtue of a physiological measure is that it's not subject to the sort of self-reporting biases that we've often mentioned in this class, right? It's not subject to social desirability bias. It's not subject to a demand effect. In other words, the subjects cannot control what's going on in terms of, for instance, their heartbeat or their pupil dilation, or in this case, their skin conductance. These are things that happen at an automatic level. They're physiological, as the term implies, reactions. And so that's one thing that's good about them for our purposes. They give you maybe a more genuine look at at what's going on with the subject. What's additionally good here is that if you recall back to the theory, it's fundamentally a story about emotions. Okay, the authors are saying that the distrust in government that we're expecting is happening because of negative emotional response, and the influence of emotion on skin conductance is something that psychologists are aware of, right? So we know that when people are emotionally aroused, their skin conductance increases. And so if that's being measured, we can directly tie the treatments to emotions. Okay, so here, this is a way to get at the mechanism that's being theorized. It's a way to demonstrate that this is actually inducing emotional response, which downstream is creating this skin conductance response. So here, just to wrap up that into the discussion, the chain of events would be this, right? So you're witnessing incivility. Okay, that's creating emotional arousal. In this case, that would be specifically negative emotional arousal. The physiological response here that's being measured is increased sweat activity. In which, and we're not talking about somebody, being drenched or anything, but when you actually are emotionally aroused, it's increasing the sweat activity on your skin, which is something that's measurable. Okay, and so when the researchers hook up these electrodes to your palm, it measures those small increases in your sweat activity, and the way that they manifest is through increased skin conductance. So what the authors are actually interested in is this part of things, demonstrating that this emotional arousal is occurring, and that's being demonstrated based on what we're measuring at this point, the increased skin conductance. Okay, so this is not the overall point of this class, but it's just something that's interesting in this paper, and it's something different than what we've talked about so far in the way that our dependent variables have been measured, this sort of physiological measure. And I think it's just worth mentioning and explaining. Anyway, getting into our results, I'm just going to show you a few of the tables here. This is what I would say is the overall summary of results. This is experiment 1, but then the other experiment is the same. The darker bars, uncivil. These are people witnessing uncivil behavior in the politicians. The lighter bars, civil. And so our treatment effect in this case is the distance between these bars. Okay, so that much. Pretty big effects in terms of our general trust in politicians, trust in Congress, trust in government. And so these are significant effects. I don't think I need to belabor them that much, but these are the expectations the authors are being borne out. You expose people to incivility, and across these 3 different categories of trust, there is decreased trust in government when exposed to incivility compared to exposure to civil behavior. So the author's expectations are borne out in that respect. The skin conductance measures, which we just talked about, this would be page 11, I believe. Yeah, so here, this chart, we're not going to get into exactly how this is interpreted, so you note we're in negatives here. This is just the way that the skin conductance measure is collected. So, but the overall point here is that you have a separation between these 2 lines, where the bottom line is the civil condition, the top line is uncivil. This is indicating that there's heightened skin conductance in the uncivil condition. So this is the expectation, right? That the emotional arousal is increasing sweat activity. It's being measured by increased skin conductance. And this is just suggesting that the author's mechanism, their theorized mechanism, that this is an emotional response to incivility, that is confirmed here just by the physiological response that subjects are exhibiting. And then finally, one interesting, sort of the authors getting to a finer granularity in their results. Okay, I talked about, you have these pre-treatment questions that are asked. One of the pre-treatment sets of questions that are asked is measuring conflict avoidance, which is a scale that psychologists will often ask to get at a sense of individual differences in people's
acceptance or avoidance of conflict situations. So, this is to say that you take the entire population. Some people are, they're better equipped to deal with conflict. Some people are much less well equipped to deal with conflict. So some people will try really hard to avoid conflict situations. Some people are not that worried about being in conflict situations. This is an individual difference that different people will have higher or lower levels of conflict avoidance than other people will. And so the implications here are fairly intuitive, I think, that if you're somebody who is high in conflict avoidance or higher, here we're talking about mid to high, seeming to be pretty similar. You're somebody who's maybe going to react more strongly here upon witnessing conflict on the television. If you're somebody who, in this case, is low in conflict avoidance, you're somebody who you're not really perturbed by conflict. It doesn't bother you that much. Probably this is the type of person who's maybe going to be less subject to these types of responses we're talking about. And that's actually what you see. You break people down into these different categories. And if you're somebody who is either medium or high on our conflict avoidance scale, okay, you're somebody who seems not to like conflict that much, and so you take steps to try to avoid it. You're somebody who's responding pretty strongly to uncivil behavior on the television. If you're in this group of people who you're not really that concerned with conflict, it doesn't bother you, and so you don't really take steps to avoid it. You're somebody who is much less affected. In fact, I don't think this is a significant effect, but you see the actual average treatment effects here go into the negative category, indicating that you're actually trusting people more when you see conflict, which I don't think these are significant, so we don't really draw much inference from that, but it is interesting to note. So in general, this is, we've talked about the point of pre-treatment measures here throughout the semester at various points in time. This is one reason, right? You have expectations with respect to different types of people responding to the treatments differently. That's a good type of concept to have in your pre-treatment so that you can go after the fact and break down the treatment effect into these different groups. And in this case, you have pretty meaningful differences in the treatment effects between these different groups. And I think that is, in terms of the paper, that's probably where I'd leave the discussion. There's a little bit more we could talk about, but that's the overall point, right? So the effects are borne out. The expectations, I should say, are borne out. Trust is lower in the uncivil conditions. The physiological response is as expected. The physiological response is actually linking the treatment effects to an emotional mechanism. And suggesting an emotional response. And then one final thing I'd point out, this isn't anything that I don't think I need to show you a chart for, but specifically in experiment 2, the researchers are having a retest, I think a couple of weeks, actually 3 weeks, I believe was the time frame after the original experiment, which is interesting. It's a good question here. So we have this response, so people witness this television program, and then immediately thereafter they're answering these questions. A good question to ask is just, do these effects last? Is it the type of thing to where we see incivility and it has an effect down the line that doesn't go away? Or is it maybe the case that the fact that we're asking the question in such close proximity to our incivility, maybe that's why we have the effect, and perhaps the effect does, maybe it dissipates down the line. And so what the authors actually uncover is that the treatment effects do tend to dissipate after this 3-week period. And so this is suggesting here that it's not as though witnessing incivility once is going to cause you to have a long-term distrust in government. It's something that if it's going to result in a longer term effect, it would have to be a scenario in which somebody is being repeatedly exposed to incivility. So, and that's a plausible scenario, right? If you're somebody who pays attention to the news on a nightly manner or a daily manner, perhaps you do receive exposure to continued exposure to uncivil behavior on a very regular basis, uncivil behavior among politicians. Maybe though, if you're somebody who doesn't pay a lot of attention to politics, you aren't seeing this regular exposure, and so maybe you're less likely to have chronic distrust in government as a result of witnessing uncivil behavior. So perhaps that's an upside of not paying attention to politics. You're seeing less incivility between politicians, and so maybe you're having fewer or less severe effects on your trust in government. And so one thing I wanted to close here with, just wrapping up the discussion on incivility. I mentioned, again, what I've said so far is mostly pertaining to the book, or actually the article. I also mentioned this book. I just wanted to give you a little bit of insight in terms of what I would view as the most interesting findings in the book. I won't go into the full empirical details. The overall experimental paradigm is the same. Okay? They're actually running the same sort of experiment, a number of different deviations of that experiment, but it's the same sort of thing. They're bringing actors in, they're recording these sort of hypothetical scenarios in which politicians are behaving either civilly or uncivilly toward one another, and they're using those to just get at additional outcomes, additional things that potentially incivility is affecting. So other incivility effects. I'll put it under this heading. And so some of them are positive, actually, right? So, one thing that, and this is the finding in the article as well, but people find incivility to be more entertaining, which is, overall a positive, right? We like people to be entertained, and maybe what's more important is that entertainment makes people more likely to actually want to watch and follow politics. Somewhat of an upside, I suppose. And kind of a corollary to that, people are paying greater attention to uncivil behavior than civil behavior. So people will have the television on and actually be following what's happening if there's incivility as opposed to civility. Again, continuing these overall, I think these are all related so far. People tend to have better recall of uncivil moments. Right? So we've talked about the importance of memory at various points. If you see something on television and the bit of information is conveyed in the context of incivility, you're more likely to remember that piece of information than if it's something that's conveyed in a normal manner that lacks any incivility. And then one final thing that you see is that people tend to discuss amongst themselves incidents that involve incivility as opposed to events that are not including any incivility. So people discuss what they see on the television or the internet or wherever more if it involves incivility. So there are actually some positive effects of incivility to counteract these negative effects on trust. One other important negative, though, that the book talks about. So the book confirms these effects on trust in government, that incivility decreases trust. One other thing that incivility does is it decreases perceived legitimacy of opposing views. To where overall, this is playing into political bias. The idea that people are being locked into their own views and not really understanding the opposing views as being worth hearing out or legitimate. And so this is something it's probably an important negative to be aware of as well. Okay, that incivility is potentially decreasing the ability of sides to compromise with one another. It's potentially feeding into the overall pattern of polarization we've mentioned from time to time, right? That when if you have a debate between different sides and they're behaving civilly, that's one thing. If they're behaving uncivilly, that's relatively speaking going to make the two sides view one another as less legitimate. So they're not going to come to the conclusion that there's reasonable disagreement between the two sides. People are going to come to the conclusion they're going to take one side and think that the other side is unreasonable, which is probably not really desirable for the overall health of democracy. Okay, so I don't know how much I fulfilled my promise of being more brief for this lecture, but I'm going to leave it there. That's what I had to say as it pertains to incivility. Again, I'd remind you, just get in touch with me if there's anything in this lecture that maybe didn't come across as clearly as I wanted it to you. Let me know what your concerns are, and I'd be happy to talk with you about them. To close here, I would just give you a reminder of our final exam. This will be May the 4th. You will receive more details on the final in the coming days. I'll send out a notice here. I'll have a review sheet posted on Moodle. This will be Monday, May the 4th. On the review sheet, I'll give you information on the format. I'll give you all the things that you got for the first test you'll receive for this final. You can anticipate it being semi-cumulative, to where I'm going to try to emphasize on the test the material we have discussed since the first test, but there will be material from early in the semester as well. So in your studying, you'll probably want to also revisit that to the extent that you need to. The test here will be, you'll get the normal time frame for a final exam, so it'll be 3 hours, which you'll be able to do at any point in time on this day. And again, I'll give you all the details here in subsequent emails. One other thing I'd mention is I'm going to be keeping up my office hours in the scheduled time frame next week. I think that would be the last Wednesday we have. So Wednesday of next week, I'll be available to talk with you. Again, I'd be available to talk pretty much any time during the week within normal office hour, I should say working hours, if you give me a heads up and schedule an appointment with me. So that's it. Hope everyone is easing into their finals preparation and their finals week effectively. Everyone's remaining safe and prudent in their personal affairs, given our viral situation that's still going on. Otherwise, thanks everyone. Get in touch with me again if you have any concerns or questions, and I will talk to you guys when I have the review sheet ready. I'll send out an email and talk to you guys then. Bye.